If you're setting a fantasy lineup in week 12 of the season, you're probably still competing for a playoff spot or a bye, so this is the video for you. We're going to break down the 10 players that you need to be starting in your lineup this week and the guys that I've gotten the most questions about, believe it or not, for week 12. And let's start with Kenneth Walker of the Seahawks, who for the most part this season has been a very frustrating player. I mean, you probably took him in like the 4th, maybe 5th round of your fantasy leagues, and you really don't know when to be starting him. But last week, he finally broke out for you in some ways. 16 carries, 67 yards, and a touchdown. He also added 3 catches for 44 yards. Not really the calling card, at least this year. It definitely was last year, but not this year of Kenneth Walker to catch passes. But he had over 110 total yards, a touchdown. He looked good, but he was probably on most people's benches based on what he was doing for the past couple of months before that. So 18.6 fantasy points in week 11 just kind of reminds you about the ceiling, the playmaking ability that Kenneth Walker has. So now this week I'm getting a lot of questions like, can we start this guy? Can we trust this guy moving forward? And my answer to that is probably yes. I mean, his own head coach, Mike Macdonald, in an interview this past week said, I think he deserves and is earning more opportunities to get the ball. As you can see right here, if you were to go through and watch this clip, this was put out there by Hawkmania. So on Twitter, look, here's the thing with Kenneth Walker. This is a player who all season long has been in this split backfield. He's been getting subbed out on the goal line, even on his own birthday and prime time, subbed out on the goal line for somebody else to score a touchdown. But finally, the last couple of weeks, the usage has been changing. And the most impressive part is that he put up that big performance last week against the Rams, who have arguably the best run defense in the NFL. I mean, depending on the site that you look at, they have the number 2 run defense according to PFF, only behind the Browns. And if you look at the usage that they're giving up this year, they're only allowing 3.9 yards per carry, which is currently tied for the 3rd best mark in the NFL. So obviously a good run defense. That's what Kenneth Walker was producing last week against. We got to see him play over 50% of the snaps, 48% of the rush attempts. Zach Charbonnet was still involved, 43% of the snaps. But the very interesting thing was that yet again, for another week in a row, Kenneth Walker was the one seeing the goal line and red zone usage ahead of Charbonnet, who for the most part this year was commanding that role. We're now at a situation where Kenneth Walker isn't getting subbed out in the red zone. We saw this past week. He's not getting subbed down at the goal line either, which is opening up these opportunities for him to score. So in previous weeks when he was still seeing 15 plus touches, but basically had no red zone upside since they were subbing him out, now that's gone. He has the ability to score a touchdown like he did this past week in a tough matchup, and moving forward he's going to have easier matchups, including week 12, which is exactly why you want to be starting him. Because I mean, this is like the best possible matchup for a running back, especially one like Kenneth Walker. He's going to go on the road, sure, but he's facing the Tennessee Titans, and look at this, one of the biggest favorites of the entire season. The Seahawks are 13.5-point road favorites. They're not even at home in this game. They're 13.5-point road favorites. If they were at home, they'd be like 17-point favorites or so against the Tennessee Titans defense that, look, their run defense currently allowing the 7th most rushing yards per game. 135 rushing yards per game. If you filter by touchdowns, rushing touchdowns right now on NFL Pro, we need to refresh this. They allow the 2nd most rushing touchdowns in the league, as you can see right here, with 15. So part of this is just because teams get up on them. Teams are 13-point favorites like the Seahawks this week, and they're able to just run the ball, especially in the 4th quarter, and pick up a lot of rushing yards per game. Like overall, I don't think the Titans run defense on a play in and play out basis is that awful. But either way, the Seahawks should play with a lead for most of this game, especially in the second half. I think Walker is pretty much in line for another 15 plus carries, probably at least 1 touchdown, maybe multiple in this game, and he definitely needs to be in your lineup as a top 20, maybe top 10 RB this week. And I also think Alec Pierce coming out of his bye week needs to be in your lineup, because before the bye week in week 11 for the Colts, this guy was already becoming an every week starter in fantasy. Over his last 4 games, in the Colts' last 4 games, he's been the number 1 wide receiver ahead of Michael Pittman on the Colts in target share, in receiving yards per game, and in fantasy points per game. Now here are his last 2 outings, 2 weeks ago, or 3 now because of the bye. 6 catches, 115 yards, led the team in receiving yards and yards per catch. Past time out there, he has his first touchdown of the year, 21 yards per reception overseas in that game, 4 catches, 84 yards. And the most impressive part about this was in a game where the run game was taking over, where Daniel Jones was struggling with turnovers. Daniel Jones in that contest overseas only had to throw the ball 26 times because Jonathan Taylor was rushing for 244 yards. And despite that, despite a game that was clearly a run-heavy script for the Colts, you still got Alec Pierce going out there and scoring 84 yards, a touchdown, multiple catches, 20 fantasy points yet again. And here's the pace according to Sleeper NFL over on Twitter. In his last 4 games, he's averaging 8.7 targets per game, 91.5 receiving yards per game right now. Heading into this week, since he's been so good, he's actually currently projected for more in the props markets, more receiving yards than Michael Pittman. 61.5 in this game right now for Alec Pierce, 52.5 right now for Michael Pittman. That's the type of player and the type of role that you have to view Alec Pierce as. He's no longer a waiver wire wide receiver like he was earlier in the year. He's no longer a spike week player like he was back in 2024 with that Anthony Richardson. This is a top 24 wide receiver week in and week out right now. That's how I have him ranked this week, and he's basically a must start unless you're absolutely loaded at the position. And heading into this week, he gets a matchup against the Chiefs. This was a pretty helpful tweet from Derek Brown over on Twitter. He says, Kansas City coverage deployment this week presents a wide range of outcomes for Indy. Kansas City has been more single high, which would have meant Alec Pierce and Tyler Warner leading the way. Last week, low, that flipped to 58% too high. I think that was mostly because of the matchup. I think you're going to get a lot of single high coverage from a good Kansas City Chiefs defense this week, which is normally going to be beat by pass catching running backs. It's going to be beat by tight ends in the middle of the field and outside field stretching wide receivers, which sets up nicely in theory for Alec Pierce. It's also nice because if we pull up DraftKings right here, you can see that this game against the Chiefs, the Colts are actually going to be road underdogs, 3.5 point underdogs, but the game has a 50.5 point total according to DraftKings Sportsbooks, one of the highest, I believe, tied for the highest total on the entire week. So you can expect a lot of points this week. The Colts are expected to trail at some point in this game as 3.5 point underdogs most likely, so it should be a more pass heavy script for Daniel Jones compared to the last time we saw him, and Pierce should be in line yet again for 6 to 10 plus targets. So start Alec Pierce and also start Brock Purdy, who finally returned from an injury last week after only really playing in 2 other games this season due to some injuries. He came back in and he looked like a absolute slam dunk quarterback, a guy that we had ranked as a top 10 quarterback entering the season with a bullet, and that's exactly how he looked in week 11. Because on just 26 pass attempts, he was insanely efficient. 200 passing yards, 7.7 yards per attempt, 3 touchdowns to no interceptions, was only sacked once in that game. He didn't even have to open it up with his legs. Just 1 carry for -7 yards in that game. We know Brock Purdy, although he's banged up, he has the toe injury. We know he also has the mobility, and even though he wasn't running around in this game because he basically didn't need to, we saw him be mobile. We saw him move out of the pocket, be nimble in the pocket as well, evade pressure, and he looked like just normal Brock Purdy. They said he was going to be a full go, and he looked like a full go. Overall, Purdy in this game had an 82.6% adjusted completion percentage and 133.5% passer rating. That is fantastic. Now, this was against the Arizona Cardinals. Most teams this year have been dominating the Arizona Cardinals defense, a unit that just put so much in terms of free agency in the draft into their defense, and as of right now, because of injuries and just poor play, it's not really panning out. And that led to the advantage for Brock Purdy, but it's not like it was just this one matchup for Brock Purdy. I mean, we've seen it in past years. This is a guy who completed 69% of his passes 2 years ago. He completed 66% last year, on his way to being a top 10 quarterback in both of those seasons. And do you remember the stretch of games that Brock Purdy had last year towards the end of the season? 24 fantasy points, 20, 26, 24, was a top 10 quarterback in all those games. Comes back from an injury and finishes with 22, 22, and 32 in 3 out of his last 4 games last year. This was a guy who in the second half of the season had more 25-point games than he did less than 20-point games. He was fantastic. And if you even zoom back to 2023, he was a top 6 quarterback in fantasy points. He was top 5 overall in quarterback efficiency and passing yards. He's been good anytime he's been out there, and that's exactly what we saw in week 11. So yeah, heading into this week, he's a must start as a 7-point home favorite with a 49.5 point total. And as a big home favorite with a 49.5 point total, this means his team is projected for top 5 in the overall projected points this week against a Panthers team that has been solid this year. They've been hit or miss on defense in their secondary and even their run defense, but I think this is a nice spot for Brock Purdy to just continue his trend. George Kittle is yet another week healthy and looks awesome. Juwan Jennings is yet another week healthy and looks awesome. Ricky Pearsall is back for a second straight week after playing a full complement of routes last week. Right now in my rankings, Brock Purdy is a top 8 quarterback this week, and he's a slam dunk must start unless you have one of the elite guys on your roster. Now, before we get into the next player, let me just ask you something. Can you relate to this? Like every Sunday in one of your group chats, somebody says, I knew that guy was going to go off. Well, why don't you prove it? Because now you can. I've teamed up with DraftKings Pick 6, and this is exactly where you could put your football knowledge to the test to actually cash out. All right, now here's how it works. All you have to do is pick more or less on player stats, whether it's passing yards, touchdowns, receptions, and when your calls are right, you cash out. It's pretty simple. There's no complicated rules. You have to combine at least 2 or more player stats together on DraftKings Pick 6, and then you just watch your players perform. Okay, now this next part is pretty huge, so make sure you pay attention. Because new DraftKings customers, when you play $5 or more, you get $50 in Pick 6 credits. So simply put, you play at least $5 if you're a new customer to DraftKings, and there'll be an extra $50 in credits in your Pick 6 account. Pretty cool. So to get in on the action, make sure you download the DraftKings Pick 6 app now using my promo code SAL. Ride the upside and let your picks do the talking for you. In partnership with DraftKings Pick 6, the crown is yours. Now, another player I'm getting a lot of questions about is the second-round rookie running back, the pick for the Cleveland Browns, because, I mean, we mentioned this earlier in the season. Everybody kind of slam dunked on us and was making fun of us, but it doesn't matter because we said Quinshon Judkins is not in a good offense. They're going to be playing from behind a lot, and he doesn't catch passes. Once these, 2 weeks of him being good are gone, he's probably not going to be that great in fantasy. And now he has dealt with his own injury, but what has happened really over these past 5 weeks or so, he's only had 1 usable week in fantasy football. 6 points, 10 points, 4 points, 26 is obviously great with 3 touchdowns, although those were on short fields thanks to his defense, and 3 fantasy points. Basically, since he had a couple of games, his first 2 or 3 games as a rookie, when they actually stayed in those games and had a little bit better quarterback play, right? Since then, it's basically been downhill. It's going to be downhill for the most of this year because Shedeur Sanders is now starting and it looks gross, and at best you're going to get Dillon Gabriel back, and that's gross. But despite all this, Quinshon Judkins still needs to be in your lineups this week, and here's the reason. Ideally, you would have already traded him in the past, but now he's not really worth all that much. But here's the reason. 17 carries, 59 yards last week. The only other running back to see a carry, Jerome Ford with 1, Dylan Sampson with 1. This is still easily Quinshon Judkins' backfield. He saw 81% of the rush attempts last week. And now since week 3, according to Joe Oracle on Twitter, the leaders in the NFL in terms of rush shares, Jonathan Taylor 73%, Quinshon Judkins 73%, tied for number 1 in the NFL in terms of how much of their backfield carries they see. Now, this doesn't help you when you're on a bad offense. That's not getting to the red zone, when you rely on touchdowns. I get all of that, but this could be the week that we at least get some red zone carries for Judkins, because he's going to go out there and he's going to face the Las Vegas Raiders. He's also going to face the Tennessee Titans entering the fantasy postseason, which is another spot where maybe the game stays a little bit close. And so far this season, the Raiders allow, as it stands, the 4th most rushing touchdowns. Now, actually, on a per carry basis against the run, the Raiders defense, Max Crosby is great. The Raiders defense has been phenomenal. They're only allowing 3.8 yards per carry, one of the lowest rates in the league. But unfortunately for the Raiders defense, a lot of teams still opt to run the ball on them or pass to the running back quickly, just because that's where a matchup advantage exists. And usually in the second half of games like the Titans earlier, the Raiders are just probably playing from behind so teams can run on them. And this might be one of the only situations, even though Shedeur Sanders is starting, where the Browns might be able to play in a neutral game script or playing with a lead, or maybe even playing with a touchdown lead, because they're only 3-point road underdogs against the Raiders. So on a neutral field, this would be a coin flip. And this is with Shedeur Sanders starting, right? This is updated for probably having the worst quarterback play entering this week, at least on paper. I think they're going to lead on Judkins. They don't want Shedeur Sanders in a game that's probably going to stay close, throwing the ball 30 to 35 times. They probably want him throwing the ball 15 to 20 times and just give 30 carries if you have to Quinshon Judkins. Even if he's not efficient, he could probably still get to 100 yards on just 3.5 yards per touch. All right, the next situation we got to talk about is the Falcons pass catchers, because Drake London has already been ruled out for week 12, which is going to make Darnell Mooney step up on paper into the wide receiver 1 role, and also Kyle Pitts probably step up into a bigger role on offense. Now, the nice thing is we already saw this offense back in week earlier this season. I believe it was week number 8. We saw this offense go out there and Kyle Pitts lead the way, 9 catches, 59 yards in that game. Now, this was without Drake London. Darnell Mooney only had 1 catch for 11 yards in this game. Darnell Mooney did get banged up in this game. This was with a different quarterback, Michael Penix. It was obviously against a different defense as well. So it's not the exact same situation as this week with Kirk Cousins out there against a different defense. But the situation in terms of Drake London being out with that PCL sprain and potentially missing some more time is going to set up nicely for Kyle Pitts and Drake London to potentially have some more involvement in the offense. Kyle Pitts becomes a top 10 tight end this week, and Darnell Mooney, or I think I said Drake London to set up well in the offense. I meant Darnell Mooney. Darnell Mooney, the 28-year-old wide receiver on this team who had nearly 1,000 yards last year, he's going to set up well, especially because when he had those 1,000 yards, 992, he missed the game, would have went for easily 1,000 yards on 64 catches and 107 targets. Most of that production was with Kirk Cousins, who Kirk Cousins is going to go out there and be the starting quarterback this week because Michael Penix had season-ending surgery. So this is a nice setup for Darnell Mooney. We also have coach speak entering the week from offensive coordinator Zach Robinson in his second year with this team, saying at some point here, Mooney will get a high amount of targets and he'll start taking off. I think if there's any time for that to happen, it's now. When your alpha number 1 wide receiver in Drake London, averaging like 12 plus targets per game the past month, is out, and the quarterback Kirk Cousins, who had success with Mooney last year, is now in. Everything is setting up for Mooney to be fantasy relevant this week. Here's a sample of Darnell Mooney in his career now over 23 games with Kirk Cousins. He's averaging 11.3 fantasy points per game on nearly 7 targets per game, compared to the 61 games in his career without Kirk Cousins, just 8 fantasy points per game. So as of right now, Darnell Mooney sets up to be in a nice situation, I would say, with Kirk Cousins under center. I think this is a situation where Darnell Mooney, I don't think he's going to score 20 fantasy points, although it is in his range of outcomes on the upper end, but I do think this is finally the week where we start to see like a 7+ target game. It's also a nice spot for the Falcons, a good matchup against the Saints. Although they're coming off their bye week, it's still a nice matchup. They're actually underdogs coming into this one on the road, so maybe Kirk Cousins has to throw a little bit more than usual. Maybe that leads to a 35 pass attempt game. I still think in a perfect world, the Falcons just want to lean on their backfield running mates in Tyler Algier and Bijan Robinson, but I do think they're going to have to throw in this game at least 30 to 35 times, which probably more times than not leads to like 8 targets for Darnell Mooney. Now, I also want to be starting Jameson Williams. Now, a lot of you are probably like, why are you even saying this? It should be obvious we're starting Jameson Williams after what he's done the last 3 weeks, and I would agree with you, but I'm getting a lot of questions about Jameson Williams because of how bad he started off the season. But there has been a fundamental shift in what the Lions are doing right now, and it's positively affecting Jameson. Over these last 2 games, Dan Campbell has taken over the playbook, and I think he specifically took it over because Jameson Williams was not involved, because this was still one of the best offenses in the league. Everybody was getting their points. Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra, Sam Laporta, David Montgomery were doing well. It was only Jameson who wasn't, and Dan Campbell says, I'm taking over. And since Dan Campbell took over, it's pretty evident who he wants to kind of get more involved here. In the 2 games with Dan Campbell on the left, according to RotoViz here, 21.8 fantasy points per game, 7 targets per game, 104 receiving yards per game. He scored a touchdown in each contest. In the 8 games to start the season without Dan Campbell calling plays, just 4.5 targets per game for Jameson Williams, one of the lowest rates amongst any player taken in the top 100 picks. If you look back to ADP in August for fantasy drafts, and Jameson was taken in like the 5th round, so he was going to be a complete bust, but lately he's coming on. I mean, you remember some of those early games. 6 fantasy points, you had him in your lineup, he busted. Then he gets you 18, so you're like, okay, I'll keep him in my lineup. He had 2 big catches in that game, he got a touchdown. Then he gets you 6, then he gets you 5, so you're probably like, yeah, I'm gonna bench this guy. Then he gets you 2, so you're like, I'm happy I benched this guy, I'm gonna keep benching him. Then he gets you 18, so you're like, oh my god, he's back, I'll start him. He gets you 0, you get frustrated, so you sit him when he gets you 16, and then these last 2 weeks he's finally contributing nicely, 24 points and 20 points with Dan Campbell. I do think that this is a situation now, 3 straight good games, 2 since Dan Campbell took over, that Jameson Williams is without a doubt, lock it in and week out starter until further notice. He's currently a top 12 player in my rankings right now in the Fantasy Blueprint. You can check it out at jointheblueprint.com. And oh yeah, now he gets a matchup, just a great matchup this week against the New York Giants, who are just giving up points and touchdowns to opposing number 1 receivers. A couple weeks ago against Juwan Jennings, and this is 3 weeks in a row, by the way. Juwan Jennings, 4 catches, 41 yards, and a touchdown, dealing with 5 broken ribs. 2 weeks ago, Rome Odunze, 6 catches, 86 yards, a touchdown. Last week against the Packers, Christian Watson, 4 catches, 46 yards, multiple touchdowns. So opposing wide receivers are having a lot of success. If there is a wide receiver to have success in this game, you probably think Amon-Ra St. Brown. I would agree with that as well. But based on the recent developments, I think Jameson Williams, and all it takes is 1 or 2 catches, is definitely worth starting and has a big game in this matchup. I also think you have to keep starting Zay Flowers. Now, he hasn't had monster box scores recently, but at the same time, he's had 2 difficult matchups the last 2 games, and he still put up decent performances out there. He just hasn't found the end zone. In week 10, he goes out there against the Minnesota Vikings. He puts up 4 catches, 75 yards. He's the only player on this team to top 25 receiving yards. This past week in another tough matchup against the Browns, one of the better defenses in the NFL, 3 catches, 78 yards, only player on the team to drop top 35 yards in this game. Only wide receiver in this game to actually top 11 yards. DeAndre Hopkins was the only other wide receiver to record a reception in this game. So still, Zay Flowers is the primary wide receiver on this team. He's the primary pass catcher for Lamar Jackson, and I think this is the matchup where he finally gets a breakout game, whether it's 100 yards, a touchdown, ideally both. Because if you look at it right now, there's no competition. Rashad Bateman, as of this recording, is not practicing to start the week, so he might be missing this week. DeAndre Hopkins had just 1 catch last week, and he's not doing anything other than that. And outside of that, you're not looking at much here. Your only other competition is Mark Andrews, mostly a red zone weapon, and Isaiah Likely, who to start this week is also not practicing. So even if Lamar Jackson, which he doesn't normally throw a lot, but even if he only throws 25 times this week, there's a decent chance at least 8 to 10 of those targets are going to Zay Flowers in a positive matchup. And that positive matchup is a very good one. Against the Jets at home, they're 13.5 point favorites, a Jets secondary that has been atrocious lately since they traded away basically their entire defense, their best players. They traded away the defensive tackle, they traded away Sauce Gardner, they traded away everybody. Quinnen Williams, right? So here's the deal. You go over here and you see that they're 13.5 point favorites. The last 2 weeks since they traded away these players, Jerry Jeudy, who's done nothing all year long, who's done nothing since Jameis Winston wasn't stopped being the quarterback last year, 6 catches, 78 yards, and a touchdown. He actually had a good game. Last week on a short week, Stephon Diggs, 9 catches, 105 yards. Matt Collins also had 4 catches for 64 yards in that game as well. This is a secondary that is going to get roasted. It is going to get roasted, and if there's a wide receiver on this team that is going to roast them, it's basically only going to be Zay Flowers. I think this is finally the week that he breaks out. Make sure he's in your lineups. Now, if you actually want to see my number 1 must-start player at every single position for this week and every single week moving forward, I put together a completely free guide for you to make sure you're setting your lineups perfectly so you can win your matchups every week. It is linked in the description below, or you can just type into your device. If you're watching on your TV or a tablet, just type into your phone, fantasyfootballstarts.com, fantasyfootballstarts.com, enter your email, I send it right to you. Be sure to check your spam or promotional folders if you don't see it a couple of seconds after that. Now let's get back into it here with Romeo Doubs, who burned a lot of people in week 11, but I still want to put him in my lineups and recommend that you put him in your lineups entering week 12. Now, he only had 4 catches for 53 yards last week against the Giants in what was a good matchup. Only 9.3 fantasy points in PPR formats. That's not great, but he still led the team in receptions, in receiving yards, and he had 2 massive drops that probably, if he catches those balls, 2 of which he's wide open, he has 90 plus yards, and we're not even thinking about this. And this is a guy in Romeo Doubs who is not known for dropping the ball all that much, so I do think this is just sort of a fluke for the most part. I don't think it's going to be a trend that continues. In that game, though, Romeo Doubs, they still targeted him 32% of the time. He's been elite. He now has at least a 28% target share, which is considered elite in 4 of his last 6 games. He is the guy on this team that you want moving forward, at least for week 12, in what should be a quality matchup, especially since Jayden Reed is not coming back this week and Tucker Kraft is on IR. Let's not forget, before that game last week where he had those 2 brutal drops, his 6 previous games before that, basically since Jayden Reed went down with injury and a couple of games in there with Tucker Kraft hurt, 13.4 fantasy points per game for Romeo Doubs, top 20 wide receiver, 7.5 targets per game, top 15 wide receiver, 54 receiving yards per game, was the #1 red zone weapon on this team. That should only continue to improve this week and moving forward with Tucker Kraft injured. So the way that I look at it now is that this is going to be a good matchup for the Packers, especially if Josh Jacobs isn't able to play. And as of this recording on Thursday, he's only taken part in limited fashion. They said he should be able to play in week 13 against the Lions on Thanksgiving, but in terms of week 12, he might not play. And if that's the case, maybe the rush game isn't as efficient and they have to throw more. In a game where they're 6.5 point favorites against a Vikings defense that has been hot or cold this year and an offense that has not put up points, you might be in a situation where Jordan Love's only throwing the ball 30 to 35 times. But if he's doing that, most of those targets are probably going to #1 Romeo Doubs, #2 Christian Watson, and I think this is the perfect bounce back game for Doubs. I still consider him right around a top 24-25 receiver this week. He also has past success against the same defensive coordinator. The last time he played them, he had 7 catches for 58 yards in that game, and now he's even more involved in the offense because last year Jayden Reed and Tucker Kraft were playing. They're obviously not playing this year. All right, now let's go into the next player here. Kareem Hunt I want to talk about because I think in 12-team formats, he's very interesting. Probably not your 10-team formats, but he's very interesting this week. Now, Isaiah Pacheco, as of this recording, he practiced in full on Wednesday. He's trending to return. He'll probably play in this game. Who knows how much he will play, but he'll probably play. However, we've just seen Kareem Hunt actually play good football this year. The last couple of times we've seen him, 11 carries, 49 yards, a solid yards per attempt, scores a touchdown, continues to be the red zone back. The last time we saw him, 13 carries, 59 yards, still had 4.5 yards per carry, scored a touchdown. No other running back saw a carry in this game. Look at this. 82% of the snaps went to Kareem Hunt coming out of the bye week. Just 18% to Brashard Smith. 100% of the rush attempts, and the surprising thing was 61% of the routes run went to Kareem Hunt. They're trusting him in all situations. I know Isaiah Pacheco is trending and probably will return for this game, but there's something to this. Even when Pacheco was healthy earlier this year, Hunt was the red zone back. Hunt was on the field in the 2-minute situations. And now since Pacheco has gotten hurt, he's only been playing better and been more efficient. I think Hunt might surprisingly and quietly be just a starter moving forward. And this week is a nice matchup because this game, we mentioned it earlier talking about Alec Pierce, the Chiefs are 3.5 point home favorites in this one, taking on the Colts in a game projected for 50.5 points. So you can expect a lot of points in this game. I think the Chiefs are probably going to score at least 3, maybe 4 to 5 touchdowns in this game. And normally when that happens, Kareem Hunt is finding at least 1 red zone to goal line touchdown. I think he's still worth starting this week. So these are the players that I would consider must starts for week 12, and I've gotten a ton of questions about them. Now, if you want to see the players that I believe you should stash before your fantasy postseason and before your friends do, we released that video earlier this week. You can check it out right here. These are the 10 players that you must stash entering week 12.